Hello, guys, let's start this session. First of all, thank you very much, Secretary Bessent, for accept our invitation to the BTG CEO conference. You have in front of you 3,000 investors from Brazil, Latin America, abroad, and also most important CEOs and CFOs of Latin America corporations. So once again, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. Before we talk about the US, Latin America, maybe let's explore a little bit on global macro. We are in a moment, during the pandemic, most of the West democracies need to increase their budgets to support the society. And since then, since 21, 22, we didn't revert these high fiscal deficits to the moment that we have some of the most important economies like UK, France, Japan, or even US or Brazil with high deficits compared to historical standards. How you see the evolution of these deficits and if there is any consequence for the markets and, of course, the US angle about this situation. And again, thank you very much, Scott.
Good, André, it's good to be with you. It's an exciting time to be in the US, and it's an exciting time to be in Latin America, as we're seeing with all the changes going on. And that's an excellent introductory question. This year, the US will host the G20. Next year, we will host the G7. And for G20 finance track, the US emphasis that I'm leading will be on two things. Growth, or the lack thereof, as a threat to financial stability, and the importance of resilient supply chains and reclaiming sovereignty. So the reason I'm sitting here today on camera and not in the audience, wearing my hat as a fund manager, was I went to President Trump in 2022. I said, I think you're going to win the election. I'd like to be part of the economics team. And I think this is the last chance to save the US from going into a European-style malaise of high debt, raise taxes, slower growth, lower taxes, or lower tax revenue, raise taxes, growth goes down. I mean, we're going to have probably a 4-point-something% fourth quarter number, and that's with the longest shutdown in US history. So we will average about 4.1% growth for the 3 full quarters that President Trump was in. And you noticed the other day that Europe celebrated 0.3%. So in the US, we are committed to a growth solution, and I think that can be non-inflationary growth because if you look back, as you said, during the pandemic, there was a demand shock created by fiscal expenditure, but in the US, the Biden administration constrained supply with over-regulation. We are causing a demand shock largely through tax policy, but we are deregulating and creating the more space and the more supply side. So as you would have seen, and I'll give you some numbers and then we can continue on to the next question. In 2024, the US had a 6.97% deficit to GDP, highest we'd ever had when we weren't at war, weren't in a recession. Last year, that number was 5.4%. I've made it a goal of getting the deficit to GDP down to something with a 3 in front of it by the time President Trump leaves office. With that level, it stabilizes the debt to GDP and you actually start deleveraging. I wouldn't be surprised if the US doesn't have nominal growth in excess of 6% this year, and by constraining spending and growing the denominator, then that solves a lot of the problems.
No, clearly, and we all feel globally, since U.S. is the U.S. Treasury the free, risk-free benchmark for global markets. Very important to have someone like you running the economy and with this kind of mindset. Scott, there are a lot of interesting forces around the dollar or even U.S. Treasuries, right? We had some dollar weakness in the recent months. On the other hand, a lot of investments and stronger growth in U.S. And also some structural change on global portfolios, right? That we are in a moment where global central banks are increasing their gold reserves. On the other hand, you have the creation of stable coins that are dollar linked and in a certain way increase the demand for treasuries. How you are seeing this balance and the role of the dollar that will continue to be the reserve, the global reserve currency, but these different forces influence the price of US dollar right now?
Yeah, so André, I often get asked, what does a strong dollar policy mean? And it means that we want to have the fundamentals to keep the dollar strong. So in terms of whether it's FDI or portfolio flows, we want to make the U.S. the most attractive place for capital, which I think we've done through tax certainty. We passed the One Big Beautiful Bill on July 4th, which includes full expensing for corporates. We have regulatory certainty. As I mentioned, I think now this administration, for every one new regulation, has cut 23 regulations. And I believe that was a 1 to 8 ratio in Trump 1.0. And people ask me, what's my biggest surprise coming from the private sector into the government sector? And it was the U.S. had lost the ability to build things, especially manufacturing facilities, whether it was environmental regulations, a lot of state regulations. And then 3, on energy certainty, that we are back to exploiting the U.S. great natural resources, that whether it is clean coal or our energy dominance in crude and nat gas. So we want to set the fundamentals. To the extent I had a strength in my investment career, it was in currencies. And currencies on the screen go up and down, but over time, if you have the right fundamentals, then the trend exerts itself. And I would say on one side, what people are calling dollar weakness is actually whether it's many economies just coming out of a moribund state. In any currency theory, whether it's Mundell Fleming or any other, would tell you that what the euro is doing should lead to price appreciation. They are creating, especially through Germany taking off the debt brake, their increased defense spending throughout the EU. So they're creating a demand shock. And then we're seeing all the reforms in Latin America. So I don't think it's so much dollar weakness as a lot of the other countries have been asleep.
Yes. Bob, I agree with you. Scott, you mentioned a lot of deregulation and change in the energy policy, the big beautiful bill. All of that are relevant for U.S. investments. In the last 5 years, I think U.S. functional as almost a financial black hole, attracting capitals from everywhere, but especially to the technological sector that outperformed all the other sectors and concentrate a lot of U.S. market cap to the point that, well, the highest market cap company in U.S., NVIDIA, is 4.5% of global market cap, where Japan is 5%, which is the second largest country, is 5% of global market cap. On the other hand, we see a lot of interest in investing in U.S., in classic sectors, in promote reindustrialization of U.S. And a lot of Brazilian companies or Latin America companies also interested on doing that, right? The protein companies of Brazil, Embraer, well, us, BTG, as you know, and they granted us a national license to have a bank in U.S. How you are seeing the foreign direct investments in U.S. other than the innovation sector or in venture capital or the NASDAQ, but in the rest of the most traditional economy that underperformed in the last 5 years?
Well, we're seeing both FDI and U.S. corporates reshoring, and at the end of the day, that's the goal of the president's tariff policy. I've described it as a shrinking ice cube that we begin with very high tariff revenues, but over time, if we say tariff revenues are here, tax revenue is here, that over time, the goal is reindustrialization and to rebalance the economy. So as there's more FDI, as U.S. corporates come home, then we're seeing a extremely high level of factory starts and greenfield or factory additions. So the tariff revenue will come down, but the tax revenue from more factories, the more jobs in the U.S. will go up. So that's the ultimate goal of the tariff policy, is to rebalance. I can tell you, as the Treasury Secretary along the way, taking in the substantial tariff income is very nice also.
Yes. And Scott, how you are seeing this amazing, unthinkable productivity gain coming from AI and AI adoption in all sorts of sectors? U.S., of course, is on the front run for this, the front seat of this productivity global run. But what do you think will be the effects in the economy related to labor, growth? I think the appointed Fed chairman, Kevin Warsh, has been talking a lot about productivity range. By the way, Kevin was here last year, Scott, on this conference, so we had a nice chat about that. How you are seeing these amazing productivity gains that are ahead of us with the adoption of AI?
Andres, I think there's a good chance we're back to the 90s. You and I kind of cut our teeth back then, and it was an exciting time. Everyone asked me, because I ran the Fed interview process for the president, and everyone asked me, what were you looking for in a Fed chair? And did you or the president demand lower rates? Did you give them instructions on this? And I said, no, it was, we just wanted someone with an open mind. And I think Kevin Warsh is that person. That's one of the reasons, other than his long history and credentials, one of the reasons that President Trump selected Kevin Warsh. And I think one thing that's very interesting about Kevin, he fellow at Hoover. They're doing Stanford's the center, one of the centers of U.S. innovation. But on the other side, at Duquesne, he was a macro analyst, but he also, I believe, ran their private investments in technology. So he understands all of this very well. He has a very open mind. And Andres, when you ask me, I can honestly say that we're watching it closely. I think that there are many different paths this can take. What we're seeing thus far is a couple of things. I tell all my friends with children in college, recent college graduates, that they should all be AI natives. Remember the term, I think you and I are too old, but our children all became digital natives in the 90s and the 2000s. So the real value added for young people is being able to jump onto this productivity boom. And I think it was about 3 weeks ago, had a major US credit card company in. I asked the CEO, well, what's AI going to mean to you in terms of jobs? And he said, it's just an internal reallocation. So they will use more AI for billing and credit, but on the other side, all those folks are going to be moved into the travel area. So no loss of jobs, just a reallocation. And historically, anytime we have these productivity booms, there's an employment boom. And what we're going to be watching very closely, and I assume the Fed under Kevin Warsh's leadership will be also, is just to make sure that there's not a timing mismatch.
Yeah, totally. By the way, I think it was an excellent choice. We consider Kevin one of the most prepared, if not the most prepared name for the job. And my second comment related to your question is that we are not that old, Scott. We still have a long career ahead of us, right? So you will come back one day to the investment community, and I will stay here for other decades. So it's we still have a long path ahead of us.
Well, we have, me more than you, gray hair and wisdom.
Moving a little bit the conversation to Latin America, and we are here in the region very excited about the interest of U.S. being the region. You being here with us is a statement about that, and which make us excited and proud. But you also had an important intervention in Venezuela and pushing the country to a more open direction, a more constructive direction for their society. You made a very relevant intervention and support to Argentina. Just added to your bright investor career, right? Because you were the most successful long peso trader in history, probably. So just added to your CV. We perceive here in the region another level of interest and attention from U.S., which I think is the right thing to do, right? Latin America is, we are in the same time zone, have the same cultural fit. It's the most important natural resource area in the world. It doesn't matter if it's agris, metals or mining, or energy. And this is available for full integration to U.S. How you see the U.S.-Latin America relationship going forward?
I think this is a generational opportunity, and we're obviously in the U.S. very focused on north-south. And between myself, who I thought on the financial side, the Obama administration missed an epic opportunity. Many governments wanted to try more market-friendly policies during the Obama administration. They were ignored. Obviously, Secretary Rubio from South Florida of Cuban descent, the large Venezuelan constituency when he was a senator, very interested in the region. And I think you give two very good examples. So from Treasury, we were able to do a meaningful support for President Milei during the election period when we thought the fundamentals were very good. President Trump endorsed him, and the Kirchnerites were trying to use market forces to cause him to lose support. So we were able to sort of what I would call peace through economic strength, bridge the Argentine government during that period. The election was remarkably successful. He picked up more seats than predicted, and I think what's very interesting is President Milei's support among young people, among the very poor, is really spreading out. On the other side, the intervention and the extradition of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela through military force just shows the power of the U.S. military. So, one side, a flex in economic power, on the other side, a flex in military power. And I can tell you that the people running the government now in Venezuela they're cooperating. I think it is a very good partnership that will eventually lead to free and fair elections, something that seemed unimaginable. And then we're seeing a lot of economies come back. Chile, which just seemed to have a bout of temporary insanity, or Bolivia, after decades of socialist ruin, wants to come back into the system. We're very keen to help them. We're working with the World Bank and the IMF. And then there's Brazil. I think after a rocky start, President Trump and President Lula have established a good rapport. And so I think what's going on in Latin America is extremely exciting. And as you know, the way these markets tend to work is you get a repricing for the possibility of good policies, and then things may go sideways for a while, and it will be incumbent on the government to implement good policies. So, but I'm very optimistic about all these countries, and that the U.S. wants to be there to support them.
Yeah. No, it's and it's absolutely welcome independent on the political direction of the governments, as long as they practice sound policies, market-friendly policies. And your participation in Argentina was very relevant, Scott, because at the end of the day, allowed society to vote in the direction of stabilization. That was the choice, and a remarkable choice that will be extremely benefic for the Argentinian society. And here, as you said, we also notice a lot of goodwill from the Brazilian government, and it's funny because President Lula has a tradition of good relationship with Republican presidents in U.S. And I think now we are in the right tone with President Trump. I think in the next months there will be some delegation of Brazilian business people and government visiting you, President Trump, with President Lula, and I think it can be remarkable. So your more active role in Latin America is extremely well received by this audience here, just as a strong feedback for you. Talking a little bit on the rest of the world, Scott, if you could comment how at this stage you have seen Europe, Japan, and China, because different things happening in these different areas, right? You mentioned the change completely in economic policy of Japan. We are seeing a dramatic change on the political arena. The Prime Minister victory this week, I think, is remarkable. And China dealing with shrink population, but also very successful in certain industries and sectors. How are you seeing the rest of the world from a U.S. perspective?
Sure. Yeah, so sure. On Europe, there's a lot of verbiage back and forth, but at the end of the day, we want our European allies to succeed, and it's friendly criticism. I was in Davos and with a group of about 130 business leaders. French businessman raised his hand and said, "What would be your advice?" And I said, "Follow the Draghi report." It's just the level of productivity, the level of bureaucracy there really has to change. I have American tech leaders telling me it's easier to do business in China than in Europe. The purpose of the EU was to create a frictionless trading zone when in fact they've created more friction, and kind of the national regulatory body on top is just, I think, stifling growth. So I hope Europe can get its act together. It's an important ally. Could it eventually become an innovation hub? I hope so. But look, they had a failed economic plan. The plan was built on cheap Russian oil, selling into China, and an undervalued exchange rate because of the problems in the periphery. Well, the periphery is actually doing better than the core now, or many of the core companies. We've seen how the Russian energy played out, and now I think that Europe is worried about all the cheap Chinese imports coming up because the U.S. put up a tariff wall. In Japan, I think the Prime Minister is a very exciting leader. I've had the privilege of interacting with her. She's dynamic, she's focused. This was a very bold move she called with the election. It was the quickest snap election in Japanese history, and she also has the biggest post-war majority. So bold move, the high return, and she's going to be able to govern using this supermajority. And look, I think that they understand that they are closer to the end of the Abenomics reboot than the beginning, but Japan's doing very well here. Nikkei keeps showing us that. I think that the Bank of Japan, you probably know Governor Ueda. I'd known him in my private capacity for more than a decade, and I think he's fantastic. And then China, the U.S.-China relationship now is in a very comfortable place. We are going to be rivals, but we want the rivalry to be fair. We do not want to decouple from China, but we do need to de-risk. When I talked about at the beginning, when I talked about our two G20 initiatives, the first is growth, but then the second is retaking sovereignty in strategic industries, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's semiconductors, medicines. The U.S., as we saw during COVID, very dependent on China for medical supplies. So I think we can have a very productive relationship, but we're always going to be competitors. And I'm of the view that competition makes you better, keeps you from stagnating. And I'm convinced that the U.S. is winning the AI race. We have the technological lead. But in the long run, China must rebalance. I think we're probably going to see the IMF, the Article 4 announcement come out, and we will also see, I think at the G7, global rebalancing will be a topic, but the world cannot have a situation where China persistently runs a $1 trillion trade surplus. That's just not possible.
Yeah, no, there is certainly an excess there. Well, Scott, we are coming to an end, and I would like to tell you that business is open for U.S. and U.S. companies here. You mentioned the amazing AI revolution, and here, but when we look globally, we see Brazil as one of the most competitive countries to adopt giga data centers, given our cheap energy, cheap renewable energy, and a well-established grid. So it's open for U.S. and it's neutral, U.S. friendly, it's same culture, so quite open for that. And I think the same in Latin America. We are seeing more and more market-friendly policies prevailing here in the region, and part of that certainly is your support for that. So again, thank you very much for being here with us. If you want to say any final word, please.
No, I would just close what I always say is America first doesn't mean America alone. I think the world does best when the U.S. leads. President Trump is exercising great leadership, that we won't always get to our goals in a straight line, but I think that we will see that the reordering that is happening, as you very well described, in the Western Hemisphere, in terms of rebalancing trade and in terms of global security. That at the end of the day, the most bullish thing is peace. And President Trump is the president of peace. So taking out the Venezuelan problem and the mass migration, the threats, from Maduro. We'll see what happens with Iran, and then I'm optimistic on Russia, Ukraine, and if we can calm down these hot spots and get back to the business of business, then I think that's fantastically bullish for markets.
Yeah, well, Scott, the Pax Americana is more than welcome. Thank you very much for being with us, and thank you for leading this remarkable economy, the U.S. economy. Okay, thank you very much. A pleasure.
Good
Bye-bye,
to
Scott.
see you.